Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Shattered Lives. I'm Paul Healy, Chief Reporter with the Irish Daily Star. Today, the Star's crime correspondent Michael O'Toole speaks exclusively to former Garda Assistant Commissioner Michael O'Sullivan. It's a wide-ranging and fascinating chat exploring Mr. O'Sullivan's illustrious career with An Garda Síochána, from the arrest of Godfather Christy Kinahan to his days chasing heroin kingpins in Dublin in the 1980s. You'll also get to hear the former top Garda's view on the Kinahan-Hutch feud, the lack of a Garda presence at the Regency Hotel, and his thoughts on what fate may be in store for mob boss Daniel Kinahan.
Michael O'Sullivan, thanks for joining us on another edition of Shattered Lives today. You spoke to us last week for a small moment about your interactions with Cornelius Price, who, as we know, died. But there is much more to your story than Cornelius Price. So before we start getting into drilling down into this, would you mind just filling us in on your career? You retired as a Garda Assistant Commissioner. I think that was in 2016, was it?
2017, yeah.
2017. So you spent 40 years in the Guards.
Yeah, I spent 40 years in the Guards. That's right, yes.
And most of that would have been, if I'm right, in the serious and organised crime field.
Yeah, most of it was really as a detective. I was a detective in the drug squad. I was a detective sergeant in the drug squad. I was later a detective inspector, detective superintendent, and then I was in charge of it as a detective chief. So most of my service is in specialised units as a detective, really.
And why was that? What drew you to that field? Was it voluntary or were you put into it?
I suppose I had an interest in it. You got to understand, in the Guards, some people want to stay in traffic and they like that sort of stuff. Some people want to stay in particular stations. Some people want to stay in a particular. There's great variety in the Guards, in a particular role within the Guards. A lot of people don't go towards drugs for various reasons, and I, in my very early career, got involved in drugs almost by a back door, and from that, I had a strong interest in it. I suppose you could say I had a flair for it, but I liked the challenge in it. I liked the work. Again, a lot of people don't want to be searching houses with drug addicts and syringes and working in back streets and, long hours of surveillance. It's not like the movies. You could spend countless hours, weeks on surveillance and nothing would happen and the job wouldn't go right. So it's horses for courses, really.
And what was there something that drew? Was it the challenge? Was it exciting? I presume it was exciting doing all stakeouts and following people and that.
Look, stakeouts aren't exciting. It sounds it's exciting when something happens, but it can be quite monotonous. And quite challenging. You could spend hours following people and hours interviewing people and hours preparing evidence, and it is not all that glamorous. It's good when a job comes together, but it really, a stakeout is all very nice, but you sit on a roof for 6 or 7 hours a day for several days of the week, or places like that. It gets quite monotonous, and there's easier ways of working. I liked the work, however. I liked the challenge. I liked the people I worked with. And I probably came there at a particular time. I came to drugs when heroin was taking off, right at the very start. And my career probably took off with it. And I stayed in that vein of drug dealing and drug importation. And I developed a skill set for it. And I was drawn towards that work. But like I say, a lot of people would run a mile from it.
Now, one of the reasons why we're talking to you is over the next couple of weeks, Sky, I believe, are running a show called Dublin Narcos, which is a history of basically of the drugs crime epidemic in the Dublin area. And you're one of the major and important guests on that show. Why did you decide to take part in that?
Well, they came to me. They read a book that was published about 30 years ago about the drug problem. It was actually published and it libeled a number of people, and then it was withdrawn. So they got a copy of it and they decided that they ran series like Liverpool Narcos, they called it, and then London Narcos. And then they decided to do a Dublin Narcos. And they asked me would I participate in it. And I said I would. So I did. And yeah, the rest is history.
And did you enjoy taking part in it?
Again, it took a lot of, not particularly, nothing wrong with the people, but there's a lot of hanging around and taking takes and sitting in a seat. And it's not like, okay, there's a 20-minute interview. It could take the whole day, and they might take 3 minutes of an interview. So it was an eye-opener as to how they operated. And I didn't mind taking part in it. It told a particular story, and I was happy to be part of it, yeah.
Now, I haven't seen it yet, but I'm guessing that one of the words that will be used quite a lot in the show is the word called mockies. You were a mockie, and they have almost a legendary status within Garda Síochána, and probably outside the Garda Síochána as well. Would you just remind us what mockies were?
Yeah, I suppose it stems from around 82. I got involved in the whole drugs investigation, and I put forward a suggestion that in an effort to catch these drug dealers, the drug dealers had changed tack. Gone are the days that you'd knock on a door at 7 a.m. and the drugs would be sitting under the bed or whatever. You're dealing with heroin. It's a fast-moving, very secretive process. And it was sold in the inner city in the early 80s. And it was sold from flat complexes. And many of the people who sold it were hardened criminals. And to get into some of these flat complexes was like a fortress. The drug squad at the time and the guards at the time basically were still working on an old process, which was get a warrant and knock on the door and see what the drug's there. And sometimes they were looking, sometimes they weren't. But the drug problem and the heroin problem in the 80s was a whole different ballgame. I had suggested that the only way it could be done, having looked at it, was that somebody would go up and pose as a drug addict and buy the drugs. So I put forward the suggestion to some of the senior managers, and they didn't like it, and they thought it bordered on being illegal and basically crazy and basically quite dangerous. So they said it couldn't be done and you can't do it. So despite my protests to say, look, it's the only way we're going to get these people, these guys in these, etc., I was wasting my time. So myself and a couple of friends within the guards, I suggested we'd go and try it. So we did, and the rest is history. I went and knocked on a door, and when I knocked on the door, I didn't even know what heroin looked like. So it was the lack of training we would have had. I knocked on the door, and a guy came to the door, and I asked him for drugs, and he produced the drugs. And at the door, I was on my own standing there. And in fact, looking back, he was a huge, big guy at the time. And anyway, I saw the drugs, and then I took out my ID card and told him I was a guard. It took a couple of minutes for him to believe it. And then when he realized I was serious, he tried to close the door. Anyway, I went in the door after him, and he threw it into the fire. And I took it back out of the fire while he was climbing out the back window. It was on a ground floor flat. So I was hanging on to his leg, and at the same time trying to hang on to the drugs and hoping somebody could find me. But lucky enough, got assistance. So that nucleus of a couple of people who started off worked together at this undercover pioneering type operation of doing surveillance and going to doors and going to dealers in the streets and in the back alleys and in the parks and buying drugs, and then in a covert fashion, and then trying to arrest them. And in the street parlance, I suppose, of Dublin, somebody christened us mockies because we were mock addicts, and the name just stuck. And we worked at that, myself and 5 others. We worked at that for several years with quite a lot of success.
So was that the first ever, I don't know which, not a controlled delivery, but the first ever undercover purchase by a Garda in Dublin you'd be aware of?
There's no doubt. It was the first undercover. It happened actually in May of 1982, and it was the first ever undercover purchase of drugs. In fact, at the time we were told the case wouldn't hold, that it was something they called entrapment, which I knew nothing about. And they said, look, it's never going to stick. And they basically said it couldn't be done, and it did stick, and it stuck for countless more cases. And the judiciary were happy with it. You know, it was legal, perfectly legal. It just hadn't been tried. But yes, it was the first one.
And obviously management changed their mind about it then.
It took them a long time because we got into a lot of trouble at the start, and we were told not to continue it. But we knew it was right, and we knew the courts would hold. And we'd you know, you can't blame management so much. They have the guards are very disciplined, strict processes, and if they don't have a plan laid down, that if they can't, and the whole concept. Sure, we had people at the time for surveillance, but the whole concept of what they would call a test purchase or buying drugs was unheard of. So if we hadn't got rules and regulations for it, and we hadn't got training for it, and it wasn't in the policy, well, then there was obviously a good reason that it wasn't in the policy, because somebody somewhere must have decided that's crazy stuff. You can't do that. And so there was a lot of, I'd say, friction, a lot of challenging with management. Some management were more progressive, more junior managers thought, look, this is working, and the courts will hold it. More senior, more conservative managers said, well, it didn't happen in my day, so it shouldn't happen. And why can't they? You see, the guards hadn't got an understanding of how heroin dealing was done, and that was and senior management hadn't, and it was trying to convince them, which was very difficult, and they were very much rules bound. But look, with the passage of time and the support of a couple of junior managers, the likes of inspectors, who said, look, keep going, you're okay, and we kept going, and what we were doing was perfectly legal and very successful, and certainly achieved its aims. Yeah.
How bad was we always hear about this, but how bad was the heroin, specifically heroin problem in Dublin in the early 80s?
You know, there was a report carried out, and I just can't remember the name of it, but it compared the number of heroin addicts in Dublin city. It was greater than per head of the population than a corresponding New York ghetto. So basically what they were saying was, per head of the population in the inner city, and it was nearly always focused in the inner city, in the flat complexes, it was huge. It was just huge. And you look back at the deaths, and, you know, 3, 4, 5 people in a family dying from heroin overdoses. It was just ravaged. You know, it was brought in by the Duns. Young people saw maybe escapism in it. It just was a release. They didn't believe they would get hooked on it, and the corresponding effect was the violence and the crime rate rising. It was just, you know, they used the term epidemic. Was it an epidemic? It was absolutely an epidemic. The place was going crazy with it, yeah. And that lasted several years, and we're still seeing the effects of it. We still have quite a number of heroin addicts in the country now. At the time, for the first couple of years, from about 82 to, I'd say, about 87, 88, you couldn't get heroin outside of Dublin City. You couldn't get it in Cork. A guy'd have to come up on a train and buy a couple of grams and bring it back down. You wouldn't get dealing. You wouldn't get dealing in small towns. And I remember being stationed in Galway in 2012 and seeing there was Latvian guys arrested in Galway selling heroin on the street, you know. So that's how far it had come. You know, it would just show it mushrooms. That's the way heroin is. Unlike other drugs, it just mushrooms.
Okay, so as you say, as we did say, you got the rank of assistant commissioner. So you went from Garda, sergeant, inspector, superintendent, chief superintendent, assistant commissioner. Did you have a favourite rank?
I suppose. Look, I liked what I worked at. I suppose the one I would take greater satisfaction of was working as a guard, as a detective. It was less. You know, when you become manager, it's a different world. It's a different ball game, and you're less operational, and you have to do a certain amount of administration. So it was, I preferred when you were on the street working. It was I thought it was a greater job satisfaction rather than getting promoted, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay, so when you're a detective sergeant, I believe that would have been your first interaction with a man called Christopher Kinahan.
Actually, no, it wasn't. It was just before. I was still a detective when I met Chris Kinahan.
Okay, so Christy Kinahan is of course famous around the world for the drugs cartel that bears his name. What are your memories of him? Can you talk to us about your first interactions with him?
Yeah, Chris Kinahan wasn't very famous when I came across him. Chris Kinahan was a fraudster and not really known to the police, a low-level type criminal, a bit of a chancer, and had nothing to do with drugs at that time. And he saw the opportunity in the 80s. He saw the profits being made. I mean, it's like the number of addicts running around, robbing jewelry, robbing houses, robbing people, and the amount of money coming into dealers and the amount of money being made on heroin was phenomenal. And he saw that, and he was very strategic, and he was an opportunist. And he decided he would be the silent partner because he knew nothing about the drugs business. And, you know, to be successful in the drugs business, in the heroin business in particular, you got to know what you're doing. And but he took one better. He stepped back and set himself up as the person at the top of the pyramid, basically, and had people supplying. He set himself up really to be the sole supplier for Dublin City, and he almost succeeded. He set himself up in a luxury apartment, and nobody knew him. Nobody really knew him, and certainly nobody in the drugs business knew him. And his plan was to be under the radar and to have wholesalers. He was like the managing director, and he'd have wholesalers distributing the heroin to the street dealers in the city, and he was cornering the entire market.
And did the other dealers have anything to say about that? I'm sure they did.
Well, if they had anything to say, they didn't know it was him. And what you see, the way it is with the heroin business, it's different. It's very mercenary. Whosoever sells the best heroin and is available, people will buy it. And heroin is such a fluid type of drug from the point of view, one minute a guy is selling it for 3 days and he mightn't have it for a month. And it goes so quickly. And it depends not just on the supply and demand, but it depends on your supply. How much weight, as in ounces, kilos at times, can you buy? How much can you afford to buy? And how long can you keep the customer base satisfied? So people could run for a week. So it is basically quite disorganized in the city. Whoever was on the ground with the heroin got to sell it. And it wasn't as organized like it could be now, that people said, well, you can't sell here, you can't sell there. If somebody was selling heroin, people went to them. And if the heroin wasn't too bad, if it was rip-off heroin, like, they could cut the heroin down to 10%, 15%. People wouldn't get a hit, so the word would be out, don't go to that guy. So he was selling good heroin at good prices throughout the entire city, but nobody knew he was selling it. And because there was 3 or 4 layers and firewalls protecting him. So and he was making a lot of money at it at the time.
And how did you arrested him? Was it in 87?
It was September of about 87, 86, 87. I think it was, 86, 87.
And he was, I think, was it in Clontarf? He was living in a posh apartment complex in Clontarf.
He was living in a posh complex, and myself and the crew, Noreen Sullivan and a couple of others, arrested him in that apartment. He was quite surprised.
And was there anything found in the apartment?
There was several ounces of heroin in the apartment, not concealed, because there was no need to conceal it because it was a safe apartment. And he was there with an Algerian guy. So
you got him. Was he surprised?
Yeah, he was quite surprised. He was very shocked. Yeah, absolutely. It was a big surprise to him.
Now, look, you've arrested probably hundreds, thousands of criminals. Do they all react the same way? Do some get violent? Do some shrug their shoulders? What did he do?
You know, what did he do? He was stunned, really. He was sitting down, if I remember correctly, eating a sandwich, and he stopped as we came through the door, and he was just sick. He was shocked. He was just shocked. He was dumbfounded, I guess.
And he was convicted of that, I believe.
Yeah, I think, if I remember, 6 or 7 years. Yeah.
And then he came out, and then he got done for check fraud. You mentioned at the start that he was into that sort of thing. And then he got out, I think, in the early 90s.
Yeah, that's correct. He did, yeah.
So between the early 90s and 2010, shall we say, he metamorphosized into effectively Ireland's biggest drugs boss. How did he do it?
I guess there's a number of reasons. He was lucky. he was very strategic in the way he operated. He thought outside the box a lot. Now, I'm not saying he's the smartest guy in the world. He was caught 2 or 3 times. I think he was very lucky. He went to Holland, if I remember correctly, did a stretch over there. But he went to Holland anyway, and he met up with people there. He left Ireland, where it's very parochial and a very closed market. He went to this nest of drug dealers. I mean, say Holland, because of their liberal laws, rapidly became a who's who for every sort of a drug trafficker. There was Colombians, there was Dutch, there were Russians, you name it. There were Moroccans. It was a who's who. So he arrived over there and he made a lot of criminal contacts. And he realized he still had that main aim, being the silent partner, being the head of the pyramid. And he realized he could supply the Irish market. In fact, he could supply several markets. And I guess when he was in, when he gets to Holland, the Dutch have their fill of criminals. They've loads of criminals, and he's just another guy, Ireland was too small, and his cards were marked. So he worked at what he worked at, and he worked a number of good enterprises and developed money and met people who supported him and worked with him in the criminal organization. And it developed from that.
So the more you went up the ladder in the drugs unit and the Garda National Drugs Unit and what became the Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau, you probably would have had more of an overview. Would it be fair to say that as you went up the ladder, he went up the parallel ladder in criminality until he was one of the major criminals in Ireland and Europe?
Yeah, I guess so. It's just we both stayed in the drugs business, I suppose, for 40 years. Parallel, I guess.
Were you surprised looking back? Do you think, okay, yeah, I can see why he got there?
I can see how he could be successful. I didn't think he would be as successful as he was, but I suppose nobody featured in. If he stayed in the heroin business, it may not have been as lucrative. Nobody saw cocaine being as popular as it has been for the last 10 years or so. And, like I remember 82, 83, in a whole year, if there was 2 grams worth of cocaine seized, that's all. Whereas cocaine has revolutionized criminal gangs and has revolutionized cartels. And people hit on this market of getting coke from South America to a massive market, a massive consumer base. Like currently, I think the estimate is the cocaine market alone for Europe is 13 billion, 13. So, so nobody saw the drugs business becoming so global. But then everything became global. The world became a smaller place from the 80s up to now. And back in the day, it was a big deal for a guy to get a contact in London to bring heroin back. And then maybe the Netherlands, like half the guys in Dublin didn't know where Colombia was or South America and wouldn't have a contact. Whereas once you make those contacts at a global level, once you have people who know a man here or a man there, those production lines, those processes become quite efficient. If you talk to your man in Bogota and he talks to your man in Holland and you talk to a fisherman somewhere else, and before you know it, you've got millions of euros worth of coke, and it makes a lot of people very rich.
And Christy Kinahan and the Kinahan cartel are extremely rich people. They are an extremely rich gang.
Yeah, they're extremely rich. Yeah.
Were you surprised? And because you left in 2017, so that was at the height of what became known as the Kinahan Hutch feud. Were you surprised by the development of the feud?
I have to say, I was at the start of it. I was at the Regency and was part of an investigation team in February of 2016, I think it was. And so I was around for that, and I was part of the early investigations into the murders. And I was surprised at how fast and how reckless things became. It was just, as somebody said, it was a feud on steroids. It was just, there's no rhyme nor reason. This was crazy stuff. And this was, this is just crazy stuff. I think everyone was surprised at the ferocity and viciousness and the pointlessness of what went on. Yeah, crazy.
Have you been able to rationalize why? I mean, let's be honest. It was the cartel, Kinahan cartel, which was doing most of the actions and killings and attempted murders. What is your rationale for their ferocity?
The people behind the deaths did it because they could. Did it because I think power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And they had so much money and they had so much power that they thought, these are guys, the people responsible are guys who believed their own propaganda. And off they went and did what they did.
So you might not want to name him, but I can. You're talking about Daniel Kinahan there, really, aren't you?
Well, whoever, and I don't want to preempt anything, but whosoever was behind it and the grouping behind it, that's my theory on why they did what they did.
Do you think if Christy Kinahan had been at the helm or running things or had been in control, it would have gone the same way? Or would it be a wiser head?
I think more sensible people in the group would have said, you can't do this. You can't do this on a number of levels. You can't do this for all of the reasons, the humanitarian reasons for starters. You cannot go taking lives like that. Leave that. That's one side of it. But from a business perspective, you can't run around like Al Capone and not draw attention to yourself. The more successful groupings are the people who are selling drugs, who are behind crime and are keeping their head down. They're not drawing attention to themselves. You do that sort of stuff and you will draw the attention of law enforcement. And that's what happened.
And this is my contention. I don't know what you think. I'd be interested in your view on this. I think in 2016 and 2017, particularly 2016 after the Regency, the cartel, the Kinahan cartel, in my opinion, was a direct threat to the authority of the state. Would you agree with that?
I think, yeah, yes, I would agree. I would agree that the cartel didn't care about law enforcement, didn't care about the state, didn't care about the guards, the government, and certainly it didn't care about the victims. The power had gone, the people behind it, the power had gone to their heads, and they just thought they can do anything.
And Michael, as we know, the cartel leaders, the alleged cartel leaders, have been sanctioned. There are rewards of $15 million by the Americans. What do you think, with your vast experience and knowledge, the end game is here?
Well, I'll put it to you this way. The DEA are on the trail of that cartel, and nobody has yet outran the DEA, and they're in it for the long haul. The DEA you just have to look back, Chapo Guzman. I think they caught him not once, but twice, if not three times, I think, when he escaped. You look, if you have to go back to Escobar, you look at their track record for breaking cartels, for arresting government officials who are corrupt all over the globe, and they have a huge global reach. The world becomes a smaller place when the DEA are on your trail.
So they're in trouble.
Yeah, they're in trouble. Yeah.
Michael, just the last question on the Regency. And I remember the then Commissioner Noreen O'Sullivan said afterwards, because there was, we can't gainsay this, there was criticism of the Garda Síochána after it, and she insisted, especially for not having any Garda there, she insisted that there was no intelligence of anything happening at the Regency. Yeah,
you see, I suppose you look back at the criticism. One of the criticisms that I remember being at a conference, and one of the several murder conferences, and people wanted results, and they wanted results. Investigations take time, and when you look now back at what happened at the Regency and the unfortunate deaths following the Regency, The guards went and did the heavy lifting, and you look at the successful track record of arresting the perpetrators for most, if not all, of the murders, and I've sort of lost track of them at this stage, but any one of those murders was extremely, you had hit teams going out, shooting somebody, a car was burnt within 5 minutes and everybody was gone, and then the guards had to pick up the pieces. They have the track record of being exceptionally successful in their investigations following those hits. Now, back to what you said about the intelligence. Look, intelligence, I was in the drugs, I was the chief in drugs and organized crime at the time. Look, you deploy resources, the scant resources you have, you deploy them to where you know illegal activity is going to happen. And the purpose is apprehend the people doing the illegal activity. If a couple of guys are flying over and they're going to have a handover, and you know this is going to happen, you would deploy resources because this is going to be an illegal act and there's a possibility of seizing drugs and arresting people. And you gear your strategy on that. If a bunch of them are coming over to go to a 21st party, you're not going to put, what is the purpose in putting a surveillance team out there? One, even leaving aside not getting blown, what is the purpose? They're going to be hanging around looking at guys getting drunk. You know, it's about the legal and the illegal activity. Criminal groups do lots of different activities, and we've lots of criminal gangs, and they do lots of different activities. And you have to gear your resources to when they do the illegal activities. So people meeting for a weigh-in is no different than the people going down to the point to watch a boxing match, or the people going to a session, or the people going to a concert. You know, no, what you need to do is deploy the resources to the potential illegal act which your intelligence relates to. Back to the Regency, nobody thought anything was going to happen at the Regency, least of all the Kinahans. And a handful of people knew this was a surprise attack at the Regency. It could have happened in O'Connell Street. It could have happened as they drove from the airport. And as I say, the Kinahans was a surprise to anyone, as the guards were. So if somebody was to tell me that everybody knew that like the weigh-in was happening, was a matter of public record, there was just no point. You know, what happens then to a boxing match? Do you send people out there? What's the point? No. It is a misconcentration of resources to have your people chasing every time criminals go from A to B. You'll be at nothing. It's selective operations, and a way-in was never going to be a selective. Now, if there was intelligence, there's going to be a shootout. That's a different ballgame. But there wasn't, and there was absolutely nobody had any idea. And if the criminals had no idea, we certainly had no idea.
So would you and your other management have been frustrated by the, maybe not armchair criticism, but criticism by people outside the force of there being no Gardaí there?
Yeah, people would automatically, there should be guards there. Why should there be guards there? And if they move down the road and go on a session in the pub, should we put guards outside that too? These are people, this isn't a couple of guys coming in over from Colombia to a meeting in a hotel. That's a different ballgame. These are people coming over to meet their mates. They do it every weekend. They do it every couple of weeks. They do it quite regularly. They come to see girlfriends and friends, business associates, fellow criminals. They come to party. They come to have meals in Italian restaurants. They come to do lots and lots of things. And not just them, but other important criminal groups do that. So what would you put guards there? For what purpose would you put guards there? No. Would you put guards if they came over covertly or they sent a courier over? Yeah. It depends on the operation. It depends what you're going to get out of it. And you have to deploy resources with that in mind, strategically.
That's the best explanation I've heard of it, I have to say. No, Michael, look, I've kept you for a long time. Can I just ask you very briefly, you left the Guards in 2017 and you became head of a group called MAOC-N, which is, in layman's terms, which is the European Union's anti drug smuggling organization which tries to stop drugs coming from South America reaching Europe. Was that a totally different ballgame for you? Was that even a higher level what you were doing in the Guards?
The Maritime Analysis Operations Centre is a centre based in Lisbon, Portugal, that represents 7 European countries. And basically what it does is, it's what they call a fusion centre, where you work with law enforcement and military and target vessels bringing drugs to Europe. It's the front line, I suppose, of law enforcement for Europe, working in close cooperation with the navies, in particular the Irish Navy, and we would intercept vessels coming from South America, bringing tons of drugs to Europe for the various cartels. At the end of 2022, I think we had intercepted 23 vessels with a total value of just over 4 billion euros worth of drugs. So sizable seizures, sizable effects on cartels of all nationalities. And we work closely with we have the DEA with us as well. We work closely with the Drugs Enforcement Agency and all of the other international agencies. So it was, I suppose, coincidental that I was working, or fate maybe, that I was working at that level at drugs. And it was quite interesting and quite challenging. I did that for 4 years.
And was it an eye-opener just to see the scale of it?
Yeah, I think it was an eye-opener for everyone to see the scale of it. There was lots of eye-openers. We had a situation where at one stage we caught a submarine, as well, a semi-submersible. It wasn't quite submarine, but it traveled for 23 days from the Amazon with 3 men on board and 3.5 tons. And it was very difficult to detect, but naval people told us it couldn't be done. You couldn't get a lot of semi-submersibles are caught down in South America, heading up to North America, 2-3 days trips maybe, and they're intercepted by the Coast Guard and that. But some of them get through. But we had feelings that they were coming to Europe, but we were told it couldn't possibly have a vessel big enough or powerful enough and have enough fuel. But this one had. And we intercepted it off the coast of Galicia in northern Spain. So it was, that was an eye-opener. It just shows you the lengths. We also deal with aircraft. We seized the number of aircraft, sort of small aircraft, hopping from continent to continent and flying then into Europe. So it's a busy spot. But you have to remember there's tons of cocaine in South America, and there's a huge market in Europe. And South America are feeding that market. And there's more and more ships coming.
And would you think that Europe is the biggest market for cocaine?
Somebody said, and I would well believe it, there's Europe, they say there's more cocaine coming to Europe than there is to North America, and the prices are better in Europe. The only place the prices are better than Europe is Australia. It's a huge consumer base in Europe. A young population, not just young people, older people are using it too, but there's plenty of money in Europe to spend on cocaine. And South Americans see that, the drug dealers in Europe see that. And the unfortunate thing about cocaine is, unlike the other drugs, unlike hash and unlike heroin, it's the fuel that drives and grows organized crime. I see back over the years, you'd see guys who were into robbing houses and robbing cars. Now they're selling a couple of kilos of coke and they're driving around the big BMWs. The same on a global level, you will see it in Europe. It's fast cash to a consumer base, and there's low risk in it. You get a couple of kilos and you get a few phone calls, and a lot of criminals, you'll see it in Ireland, a lot of the criminal gangs are gone from robbing banks, robbing security vans, and they are in the coke business, and it is what drives it, and it's what makes the profits.
Do you see the war, what we call the war on drugs, do you see it ever ending? Is it going to be an unending war?
People call it the war on drugs. It'll go on and on. There's nothing that will stop drug use and drug importation. The war on drugs can certainly limited. It's the war on drug use. You can limit the supply of drugs coming in, but it's what is also needed is education. People being told, look, and it's very difficult to tell some young engineer who's taking coke at the weekend, who's far more qualifications than you, and maybe smarter than you, and it's difficult to tell him drugs are bad for you. And there's that element of it, you know. So as long as there's consumer bases, people will buy drugs, and the knock-on effect is it will grow criminal empires and undermine society. There's no quick fix. The war on drugs is here to stay, but drugs are here to stay, and drugs in society and how they rip at the fabric of society is here to stay. So it's an unfortunate fact of life.
And what would you say to people who say, you know, the war on drugs has failed and it is time to legalize or decriminalize drugs?
Well, that's a cop out. You know, what is the answer then? Let everybody bring over the coke. Let them bring in hash and let them sell heroin. The war on drugs was never designed to stop drugs being used. It's part of a system to try and minimize drugs. It's a war on organized crime. You know, if you take drugs out of the equation in the morning, you will still have organized crime. They will still be kidnapping and robbing banks. I suppose one of the best examples I can give. I was working in drugs when the head shops were around. We had 10 or 15 head shops in Ireland. Some of them running 24/7. They were selling all sorts of mad powders. We had drug addicts calling to the drug squad telling us, you want to close that shop down, they're selling powders and, you know, it's driving people mad. And we had young people, young school kids, we had people buying it. And we used to put guards outside the place trying to dissuade people because it wasn't against the law. It wasn't illegal because some of them powders effectively weren't mentioned on the schedule under the Health Act, for want of a better term. And we were frequently being told by young people buying it, well, if it's not illegal, it's not harmful. And you could see the floodgates open with young people taking these drugs. If you legalize or decriminalize drugs, whichever you want to do, there's absolutely one fact that's rest assured. The consumer base, the number of people using drugs, will multiply. There are thousands of people who don't use drugs because it's against the law. They're afraid of the criminal sanction. There are some countries, like I mentioned earlier, the Netherlands was a basket case. The Netherlands did that back in the day. And if they could turn it back, they would. You let the genie out of the bottle. There's no going back. You know, people often say, oh, look at the Portuguese example. Well, I worked 4 years in Portugal. They had a very draconian system because they had a dictatorship. And after that, they brought in a new system 10, 15 years after the dictatorship. And I actually worked back in 94, 95. I was on secondment and I worked with the Portuguese police. You now have a system where, you know, if you're caught with a small amount of drugs, you can go and see this committee. You don't go to court. You go and see the committee, and the committee say, look, hey, don't be doing that and come back to us again, will you? Just trying to do it again. So what's the knock-on? Now, that sounds like a great system. We might do that. What's the knock-on? Well, the knock-on effect is the police aren't stopping people smoking hash. Why? Why bother? You're going to go and see two people sitting in an office and they tell you don't do it again. And why am I spending my time? So drug use. Soft drug use, if there is such a thing, has multiplied. And there's no easy fix. Oh, the war on drugs isn't working. Well, have you got a better solution? You want to legalize everything. Well, that's great, you know, but that is not going. And so we said, what about best international practice? I've spent 45 years in law enforcement. I've worked all over the globe. If there's international best practice, I haven't seen it. I wish somebody showed me where it is, because it isn't out there. There is no country who has it right. And believe it or believe it not, and there's a tendency in this country that you have to look to the UK, you've got to look to the States, I'm sure they're better. The Misuse of Drugs Act 77 and 84 are, you know, they're well thought out pieces of legislation. You get caught with drugs, you can get an adult caution. You go to court, you might be told to put money in the poor box. Nobody goes to jail if it's the 6th or 7th time with hash. It is seen as a deterrent carrot and stick approach. People using heroin, the case is normally put back for a year to see where they go, or a couple of months probation report, and to see if they will get treatment. You know, it can't be any fairer than that. And you know, it works. It absolutely, particularly in the heroin side of things, it absolutely works. But there's a tendency to knock what we have. What we have is very effective. Now, that's just my opinion.
So what you're saying is in 50 years' time, there's going to be a Mick O'Sullivan talking to Mick O'Toole about their careers in crime journalism and anti-drugs activity. This war is going to keep on going for a long, long time.
Yeah, it's going to keep on going. It's the way, it's part and parcel of life. And we have to minimize drug use, however we do it. And it's a number of things. It is drug treatment, it is education, those three pillars, and it is law enforcement, you know.
Michael, that was an absolutely fantastic interview and I really, really enjoyed it. And thanks a lot for your time.
You're very welcome.